Hi everyone, just letting everyone into the meeting. I'll just give it 30 seconds as everyone joins us. We've got lots of people joining us today, so I'm really looking forward to hearing from you as we talk about planning for solar farms and battery energy storage systems. I'm not going to give it very long because we have loads of content to get through, and I know you're all very busy people. Maybe 10 more seconds so everyone comes in, and I welcome you. I'm not very good at waiting, so I'm gonna make a start, and we can use the chat to welcome other people as they come in. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on planning for solar farms and battery energy storage systems. I'm Hazel Williams. I'm a director at Regen, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to today's training, which is delivered with the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and GB Energy. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We know how stretched many local authority planning teams are, and we really value your engagement today. If you have any technical issues, please do mention them in the chat, and Arlen from the Greater South East Hub will give you a hand. So thanks, Arlen. Today's training is designed to be practical and supportive, and we really want it to respond to the challenges that you're facing as planners. So during the session, we'll use the question and answer function to collect your questions. If you go on the three dots at the top, you can hover over them, you can see the Q&A bar. I don't know the word, bar. If someone wants to just drop a question in there straight away, then it will bring it up for everyone. You should be able to see it quite easily. You can also put things in the chat if you can't find that. That's no problem at all. For now, I'd really like to invite you to put something in the chat during this introduction about what you'd most like us to address in today's session. So if there's something that's really a burning question for you, or the key thing you want to look at, then please pop that in to the chat, and we can bear that in mind, come back to it, think about it, gives our presenters some of that insight into what you're looking for. It might be that those are the issues you're seeing in applications, areas where you'd welcome more clarity, challenges you're encountering in decision making. So we're really aiming to make today as interactive and engaging as possible, and really want the guidance to be something that you can use. So please let us know what the issues you're facing are. I'm going to start just by welcoming you to Regen. For those of you who are less familiar with Regen, we provide independent evidence-led insight and advice in support of our mission to transform the UK's energy system for a net zero future. We know that a transformation of this scale will only succeed if it engages the whole of society and delivers a just transition where people and places are brought along, not left behind. So planning is a really important factor in that. Regen's a membership organisation. We've got over 200 members who share our mission, including clean energy developers, businesses, local authorities, community energy groups from across the country. And we also manage the electricity storage network, which is the industry group and collective voice of the grid scale electricity storage sector in Great Britain. And we've got Becky here today representing the ESN. Importantly for today, supporting local authorities is really central to what we do. Our local work, whether it's energy planning or community energy capacity assessments, is really grounded in a strong belief in making the transition work for local people and places. And the guidance in today's training really sits within our mission. We're pleased to be delivering it in partnership with DESNZ and GB Energy. So planning plays a really crucial role in delivering a clean, secure and affordable energy system in the UK. And the planning system is what enables energy projects to move from proposal to reality, while ensuring that potential negative impacts are avoided, minimised or mitigated, and that benefits are maximised for communities and the environment, both locally and nationally. We really recognise that local authority planners are under increasing pressure with resourcing challenges, with skills shortages and growing caseloads, making it harder to assess the rising number of clean energy applications. And we can see that in the number of people attending today to want to get the real insight and into what's happening in these new or rapidly evolving technologies. So today's training session really is about supporting you with the evidence and information to work on solar and battery storage applications and policy, recognising the vital role you play and providing practical support to help you do that role with confidence. You should have received a draft copy of the guidance. Oh, I'm on the wrong one. There we go. You should have received a draft copy of the guidance for planners on solar and battery energy storage systems. The guidance has been developed by Regen. It's a practical support tool for local authority planners. We've worked with DESNZ, with MHCLG, with renewables developers and planning lawyers to develop the guidance and make sure it covers everything it needs to. It's not formal planning policy or statutory guidance, and it does not replace the National Planning Policy Framework, planning practice guidance, or local development plans. Instead, it's designed to be used alongside them and with your expertise. So its purpose is to provide a clear overview of the key considerations that typically arise when assessing clean energy developments and to support consistent evidence-based decision making. So today's agenda, as I say, is quite packed, but our approach is to try and host an interactive session that supports you to learn about the content of the guidance, to share some of your experience and hear about the developer's experience too. Today, we're focused on ground-mounted solar and battery energy storage systems, and we'll run another session on onshore wind and network infrastructure for the Southeast on Tuesday, the 19th of March at 2 p.m. As you can see in the agenda, we'll start with an introduction to the policy context and then look at the guidance and issues for batteries with Rebecca Fowle, who's recently produced a fact checker for the ESN, kind of getting into the issues around battery storage systems. And then we'll move on to ground-mounted solar with our guidance author, Holly Hoban. We've got some time for you to share your experience too, and please jump in the chat and use the Q&A for that too. And we're really pleased to be joined by Gary Campbell-John from Harmony Energy and James Jameson from Starlight Energy, who'll share their on-the-ground experiences of developing projects. We're also joined by Dale Hunter from Land Use Consultants, who's an experienced renewable energy planning expert and will help us answer some of your questions. So thank you so much to everyone for giving your time, for participating, and to the panel in particular. I'm going to hand over to Holly, who's going to give us our introduction to policy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hazel. Yeah, so as we think about the role of planners, it's really important to understand why the UK government is prioritising these technologies and what that means for the applications that you'll be seeing. So in December 2024, the UK government published the Clean Power Action Plan 2030, or CP30, which set some really ambitious targets to rapidly scale up both renewable generation and electricity storage. And as you can see from the targets we've included on the slide, in order to meet CP30, we need a really significant increase in deployment of both solar and batteries over the next few years. Solar is one of the cheapest and fastest renewable technologies to deploy, which makes it really critical for achieving those near-term targets. And battery storage can really complement solar and other renewables by storing excess electricity when generation is high and then releasing it when demand peaks, which helps us create a more flexible and resilient energy system. We're also seeing an increase in the co-location of battery projects with renewables, including solar especially, which can allow for a more efficient use of land and grid connections. And beyond the benefits for the energy system, solar and battery projects can also support local jobs and economic growth, and many can also offer community benefits, although those aren't a planning consideration. But what about beyond 2030, looking past these particular targets? Well, we're expecting demand for electricity to double by 2050 as we move to electrify transport and heating, and it's clear that we're going to need more energy infrastructure in order to meet that higher level of demand in future. So a new plan is currently being developed by the National Energy System Operator, or NESO, on behalf of the UK and devolved governments, and that plan will pick up where CP30 leaves off. It's called the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, or SSEP, and it will set out a blueprint of what types of electricity generation and storage projects we need, where in the country and when, all the way out to 2050, in order to meet our demand and net zero targets. And this plan could have a really significant impact on which renewable and low carbon projects get brought forwards in your region. So once it's published, it'll be helpful to be aware that those high level targets exist for different types of technologies. And moving on to the next slide, I'm sure that most people here will be aware there have been a lot of changes in planning over the last couple of years. So we've summarised some of those changes on this slide here, but alongside CP30 and the SSEP, these changes form part of a shift towards a more strategic way of planning our energy system, which is a change away from the previous market-led approach to building electricity generation and network infrastructure. And the aim of that change is really to accelerate the delivery of a clean and secure energy system while reducing costs for consumers as much as possible. And one thing I'd just like to highlight while we're on this slide is that just before Christmas, a draft update to the National Planning Policy Framework was published for consultation. And in the draft wording in that consultation increases the weight given to the benefits of renewable and low carbon energy from significant to substantial weight. And also makes it clear in the glossary that batteries are included in the definition of low carbon energy, which makes it clear that those benefits apply to them as well. But as this is currently still draft wording out of consultation, when we refer to the NPPF in the training today and in the draft guidance that's been shared with you, we will be referring to the current version of the NPPF that was last updated in 2024. So just on the next slide as well, as Hazel mentioned, hopefully you should have received a copy of that draft guidance before this session, but this is just an overview of what it contains, the different sections there are. So we start with a look at what the current UK government approach is to solar and batteries. We give an overview of the technologies, what typical sites might include and their life cycles, and then we go through the different routes they can take through planning, the relevant planning policies, before getting into a bit more of the detail of different key decision-making factors, and also some of the end-of-life decisions as well. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Becky to give us a bit more information about batteries in particular.
Thank you very much, Holly. Hello, everyone. As Hazel mentioned earlier on, Regen manages the electricity storage network, which is there to be the industry body and voice for grid scale storage in GB. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so covering some key topics that and themes that we think you'd like to know about regarding grid scale battery energy storage. If we move on to the next slide. Yes, so firstly, before we get into the weeds of this, we'd really like to hear from you and understand your level of interest or experience in assessing battery energy storage applications. On the screen, you will see a QR code, so you can either scan that using your mobile phone, or I believe a link should be put in the chat, which will take you to Mentimeter, which is the platform that we'll be using today to gather your thoughts. Please do reach out if you're experiencing any difficulties getting onto the platform, and we can help where possible. But the idea of this is for us to understand from those in the room what your experience of battery storage is and whether you've come across any applications to date. This can range from having never assessed any, or you might be a BESS aficionado planner. So either way, please put your thoughts down. I'll give it a couple of seconds because I appreciate there's quite a lot of people here, so I want to make sure that as many thoughts are being captured. But at the moment, it does appear that it's kind of down the lower end. So some have never assessed and a planning application for BESS. Some might have done one or two. So a bit of a range down that side of it. I'll keep going for a little bit. The numbers do keep cropping up. I don't want to cut people off. Okay, so we seem to have quite a lot of people that have a knowledge of battery energy storage systems, but not necessarily assessed any planning applications. So that is good to know. I'll keep going a little bit because I'm aware we've got a few people. Okay, so we've got a general sense. I will move on. The link is in the chat there if you'd like to access it. But ultimately, we can see there is a little bit of a slight leaning towards people that might have only assessed a couple battery storage applications or haven't assessed any. Thank you to those that's engaged. It's really helpful for us to understand. A key question is why do we need battery storage, and why is it critical to deliver Clean Power 2030, or CP30 as we refer to? There is a range of consumer and system benefits related to battery storage, all stemming from batteries' ability to help stabilize the electricity network and store that kind of excess renewable electricity when generation exceeds demand, and then export it during times of higher demand. The top line that we'd like to get across is that you do need significant levels of storage to enable high levels of renewable energy to get on the system, which ultimately will allow us to decarbonise. Battery storage in particular provides critical resilience of energy security services. The most well-known of these services is frequency response, whereby battery energy storage systems provide sub-second responses to disturbances in the grid. So for example, when a power station goes down or an interconnector trips off the system, battery systems are coming online in extremely quick response times and bringing the frequency of the grid back to where it needs to be, which ultimately keeps our lights on. So BESS is one of the key technologies that are providing these services at the moment in time. Next slide, please. So for context, when we look at the Greater Southeast, we've got 1 gigawatt of projects already operational from the battery storage perspective. The Greater Southeast Net Zero Hub accounts for around 38% of England's operational capacity, which is quite significant. There is a significant amount of battery storage systems in planning and awaiting construction. It's worth noting that 10 gigawatts of the 10.8 gigawatts in planning was submitted since 2024. And the overwhelming driver of this influx of applications and projects in the last couple of years has been due to the grid connections reform process. This process is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to rejig the connections queue and focus on project delivery. So we're looking at thinning out the queue to projects that are needed and are ready, where one of the readiness criteria is to have planning permission. So there's been a strong push from developers to get planning permission ahead of the deadline, as well as to ensure they were evidencing that they're doing everything they could be defined as ready. This process has been going on for at least a year and we are approaching its end now. But as you can see, it has pushed record levels of gigawatts through the planning system in a very short space of time. For some context, we've now got 80 gigawatts of battery energy storage systems across the country with planning permission. Now, we don't expect that level of applications to continue, and it wouldn't surprise me if you're already starting to see a significant slowdown in project applications. Going forward, it's likely that you will see a lower level of BESS applications. Some projects will still be coming forward, but it's unlikely that it'll be anywhere near the level of applications that you might have been experiencing in the last few years. If we go on to the next slide, I'd like to explain a bit more about the technology in general. So when we discuss grid scale battery storage, we mean anything 5 megawatts and above. And there are key components that are common to any site. This graphic shows a standalone site where the most obvious parts are the battery cells, also known as cabinets or containers. There will be a varying number of them depending on the site and the hardware chosen. And I'd like to note here that we are talking about lithium-ion battery chemistry only. There are other technologies that are potentially coming down the line, and there are some that I'll touch upon in a second. But primarily, when we're talking about battery energy storage systems, we're talking about lithium-ion batteries. It's also worth noting that this graphic provides a rough idea of what a site might look like, and specific formatting may be slightly different to the applications that you're seeing. So for example, on the next slide, we have a bird's eye view of, there we go, a bird's eye view of a site that you might be more likely to see in a planning application. So ideally, we just want to give a general understanding of the key components that you're expected to see in some of these applications. If we move on to the next slide, it's worth noting that a relatively novel feature of battery storage is the technology has undergone a rapid evolution over the last 10 years, particularly in the last 5 years, actually. There are 3 main things I'd like to highlight. The first is a huge increase in energy density. The lithium-ion cells have changed considerably, and a standard container being around 1 megawatt hour, kind of looking at a 20 or 40 foot shipping container sort of size in 2015, Over the past 10 years, we've seen a 5 times energy density increase for that same footprint of battery container. This has impacted what a site will look like and what it might be designed for and its capabilities. And energy density does have implications for future site changes, which are likely to continue as there are more dense units coming out. Another aspect of the technology evolution is the chemistry. You can see the specifics on the table, but there has been a big shift away from nickel, manganese, cobalt towards lithium ion ferrous, which is the dominant technology that almost all sites are using. This has led to significant cost reduction, which actually brings us quite nicely onto the third main technology change that we've seen over the last 10 years. So there has been a shift from smaller battery cell sizes to much larger formats or cell sizes. This, coupled with the change in battery chemistry and battery density, has allowed the cost to drop massively, and we're looking at about 80 to 90% reduction in cost. This rapid period of technology evolution means that when a project is initially applying for planning permission, developers may not know exactly what specific hardware solution they're looking to provide, because new projects will probably be coming on the market over the period in which they're applying and ultimately developing and constructing. So it does mean that developers may be looking to be a bit more flexible in terms of what a site might look like. So having an area for battery storage units rather than a specific number of units in their application, or a parameter plan approach. Looking at the next slide, as well as standalone battery storage, we have a shift towards co-location. This is mainly with ground-mounted solar to date, but it can be with onshore wind and demand centers. There are lots of benefits to co-location, and there are plenty of examples. The most famous of which is probably the Cleve Hill Solar Park, which is an operational 370 megawatt solar farm. It's worth noting that with co-location, there is often a separate battery storage site. And in the case of Cleve Hill, there was a 150 megawatt site that is currently under construction and is expected to be finished later this year, all goes well. It's worth noting that project did hit the headlines for being rejected by its local council, but it was successful on its appeal, and it is where it is now. The second key use case to highlight is long duration battery storage, which is fairly new for the battery storage sector. So this is where battery storage sites are looking to provide a longer duration, kind of 8+ hours, compared to the current 2, 3, or maybe 4 hours duration. And what I mean by duration is that they can fully export or import for that number of hours. So they have a large energy capacity and they can store more energy. The new cap and floor scheme has incentivized batteries to consider providing that 8+ hour opportunity, which does have implications for what a site might look like. It is likely that there will be less of these long duration energy storage or LDES sites coming through. We have an example from Cetera Energy, who are one of our members, who recently got planning permission for their 500 megawatt Sundon storage project. So do have a look at that if of interest. If we move on to the next slide, I wanted to touch upon some of the things that have been coming across in the applications. Fire risk is another key area that I'm sure has been coming up. It's something that the industry takes very, very seriously. New technologies are coming along all the time to reduce the risk and provide mitigation strategies. One of the key themes that is coming across the industry is the monitoring. So monitoring storage sites to ensure that the developers are noticing any small changes in the voltage so that they can preemptively act before any thermal runaway occurs. I want to re-emphasize that the industry does take this very seriously. It's also being semi-pushed by the insurance industry, as these guys are making tens of millions, if not hundreds of investment, and they want to make sure that those projects are safe and have a very low likelihood of thermal runaway. The figures on the screen show there is a relatively low incident rate, and that data was actually provided in the Clean Flexibility Roadmap. It's all very relevant. In the next slide, in the planning practice guidance on fire risk governance, there is a note that developers should have regard to the NFCC guidance. So for anyone who isn't aware, the NFCC guidance has now been updated. There was a 2023 document, but we now have a 2026 February update, which is actually a really, really useful update, which I'll touch upon next. So by taking a step back quickly, the Health and Safety Executive has the overarching powers, and there's a whole suite of legislation that the owner and operator has to adhere to ensure that they are applying and and they have ultimate responsibility to make sure that their sites are, they do apply to the legislation and meet those regulations. The planning practice guidance does encourage developers to engage early with local fire and rescue services. And there are lots of international standards that are best practices that are hopefully embedded within the NFCC guidance now. It's worth noting that the planning system's role isn't necessarily to assess what particular fire safety mitigations or projects are used, but the main driver of the planning authority is to determine whether or not appropriate guidance has been followed and whether or not risks have been minimised to as low as reasonably practical. In the next slide, we have 3 key areas that are particularly relevant to planners. So it's worth noting that there is a lot of technical guidance around the changes in the NFCC guidance. And you can look, I would suggest that you look at that, the updated NFCC guidance. There is a summary of changes if you don't want to have a look through the whole thing that I'd recommend you look through. But ultimately, there are 3 main changes. It's looking at establishing and maintaining working arrangements with colleagues. So it's really ensuring that developers engage with the likes of local fire and rescue services and existing projects to ensure that they have good representation and what a BES site could need for safety. There's also, they want the planning authority to engage with local fire and rescue services to make sure that where possible, developers are adhering to that guidance. And again, it's worth noting that local planning authorities shouldn't use the guidance as mandatory. It's very much a site specific, and it's very much a set of recommendations that you should be going on in conversations with the relevant organizations. So yes, the NFCC guidance is a really good thing to look at, but it is just guidance. Next one, please. So we also have noise. When it comes to noise, it's slightly simpler than fire. There is relevant policy set out by the Noise Policy Statement in England, and typically most developers will have certain mitigation strategies put in place, such as putting trees or planting around the outside, fencing, as well as developers will have to do noise impact assessments prior to development to make sure that any mitigation strategies and any noise regulations are taken into account for. It's noted that, and developers are very much aware that battery storage sites can be placed in rural areas, and so the background noise can be relatively low, and so they really do make sure that any noise impact is mitigated. Next slide, please. And yes, so landscape and visual impacts. So BES projects themselves are relatively compact and energy dense. They're typically not more than 3 meters high, so it's relatively small. And don't get me wrong, the transformer aspects and certain kits relating to the substation might be slightly higher, but typically they are quite low visually impairing projects. We've got a really good example on the screen, as you can see, nice green trees, nice green containers as well. So it reduces that visual impact. It's worth noting not all sites would look like this, but this is a really, really, really good example of the minimized visual impact from BES sites. Yes, I think that's it for this one.
Thanks so much, Becky.
Yes, beautiful overall. Any questions, do feel free to let us know.
So we've got questions coming in the chat, and I think what we're going to do is hand over to Gary to do the case study, and then we'll take the questions together, and so that gives Gary a chance to answer also. Yeah, thank you for questions. Keep them coming. We will either get to them in the session, or we'll follow up afterwards. So yeah, don't hold back. But I'm going to just move to Gary from Harmony. Oh, I've gone too. No, I haven't gone too far. Hand over to you, Gary.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, my name's Gary Campbell and I'm Chief Technical Officer at Harmony Energy. Apologies in advance, I'm not a planner, I'm an electrical engineer, but I'll do my best to whiz through these case studies for you. Next slide, please. Just do a little bit about, oh, sorry, was there not a slide around Harmony Energy? I could just talk about that first then. So Harmony Energy is a renewable energy developer in the UK, Europe and New Zealand. We've got a portfolio of onshore wind, ground-mounted solar and utility scale battery energy storage. Currently got 18 projects operational in the UK that we've built over the last 5 years, up and down from Scotland all the way down to near Brighton. The two case studies we're going to talk about today is our Drakelow project, which is near Burton-on-Trent, and then Middleshaw, which is up near Kendal. So the first project is our Drakelow project near Burton-on-Trent in South Derbyshire. It is a 200 megawatt BESS site. It's a 4-hour system, so a little bit bigger in terms of its energy density than maybe the projects that have been built so far in the UK. It is a transmission connected project, which means it connects to the National Grid transmission system. In this instance, it's a 400 kV, so 400,000 volts existing substation that was built to accommodate power stations which have been decommissioned and removed. The overall capital expenditure cost of a project of that scale is over £200 million. Supports obviously jobs through the construction phase and operational as well. In the specific instance, and the majority of the projects that Harmony develops and builds, we use a grid-led approach. So ultimately, we're trying to find connections onto the electricity network utilizing existing infrastructure. And there's a number of reasons for that. Ultimately, each project needs to be financially viable and practically feasible to deliver. As mentioned at the bottom of this slide, battery energy storage in the UK receives no government subsidy, and it's fully private investment. So the financials of these projects are quite tight, and variations in things like the lithium price or one of the other items at the moment is the VAT that China will apply to some of the cells and their products does swing the economics on these types of projects. So using a grid-led approach, being close to existing infrastructure is one of the key fundamental requirements that we have. In this specific instance, I think it's on the next slide, Hazel, is a map showing the site itself. So it sits in the red space in the middle of the circle. The dark grey is the existing power station, and the peachy coloured land to sort of the north and is a housing estate. That housing estate has been built on a part of the old power station site, brownfield, and we are around about 150 metres from the closest houses there across a road. And I think there's some questions in the chat just around noise. So on this specific site, we are using a bund that will be built as part of the construction phase, which will be used as a sort of like a natural acoustic barrier for that project straight away. As was mentioned before, you know, the noise assessments and the criteria that we have to meet for these projects to move through the planning process are quite well documented, and the noise assessments that we do, we have to prove through noise modelling that our sites will meet the standards. This project itself was refused by committee based on agricultural land use, and was subsequently granted at appeal. Next slide, please. And that is a 3D image of how the project sits next to the housing estate that's being built. In the sort of the bottom left-hand corner, you can just see the edge of the substation that I was referring to in the grey. The site itself, you might not be able to make out from there. You've got the transformer infrastructure that Holly was talking about in sort of the bottom of the site, and then the containers and the transformers in this sort of the dark colours as it moves through site. Not sure if you can see, but there is the bund to the north of the site, which is used for both visually screening and, as I mentioned, some of the acoustic barriers for any noise. In terms of the biodiversity net gain on this site, 35% increase in habitat and 123% increase in hedgerows on this site, which is positive from the current agricultural use. Next slide, please. The next site is over near Kendal in the Westmoreland and Furness local authority area up in Cumbria. It's a 200 megawatt system, but 2 hours in this instance. So as was mentioned before, it's got the ability to import or export power of 200 megawatts for 2 hours. Again, it's a transmission connected project to the transmission owner in England, which is National Grid Electricity Transmission. It's a bit of a mistake on there because it's not the Drayclaw substation, it's the Middleshaw substation. But it's in this instance, because it's a 2 hour system, it's around about 140 million pounds worth of investment. It is an undulating landscape in that area with long range views. However, there is quite a substantial amount of infrastructure in that area due to the transmission network and connections to other critical infrastructure, as well as a large onshore wind farm in that area. Again, the site is we used a grid-led approach on this to start with, obtaining the land that's close to the transmission connection to give the project every chance of being able to connect to meet our CP30 targets. This project actually was approved at committee, which was a great success. And some of the key considerations on this project were around the construction phase, in particular drainage impacts or potential drainage impacts with a watercourse that runs near to site. But we were able to sort of work with the local planning authority and engineers to come up with a satisfactory solution. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's the undulating land that I was talking about. I'm not sure if you can see in the distance the power lines or the tower lines. It's quite significant in this area due to its strategic connection of other assets. As it mentions there, it's agricultural land. One of the other concerns from the planning authority were construction vehicles. So our construction transport management plan was scrutinised, obviously by ourselves, using data that we've got from building our operational sites, but also with third-party transport consultants as well, which was welcomed by received by the planning authorities. Next slide, please. And that is similar to, I think, what Holly showed before. That's what the general arrangement drawing looks like for this specific site. So in the top right hand corner, you've got the red power lines. North of the road would be the substation coming straight across the road into our black coloured transformer substation area, and then the green containers in this instance are the battery containers. So on this project, I believe we've committed to use green containers, which does cause a bit of a challenge. I think one of Fran, our development director's points that she asked me to raise was just that developers generally would like to see flexibility within the planning process around, you know, things like the technology, the colours, even down to sort of the planning permission duration. As was mentioned earlier, the connections reform process that we've all been going through over the last 3 years has put some quite significant delays into connecting these types of projects. So having the flexibility to have a longer planning date just means that we can not have to come around the process again and reapply. And we've been working quite hard with a lot of the local planning authorities that we work with to sort of communicate the need for going beyond those sort of standard timescales to sort of ensure that we can deliver the projects in line with the system operators' requirements. Next slide. That might be. I think I've maybe already gone through those points, and the NFCC guidance was covered by somebody else as well.
Thanks, Gary.
That's all right.
Let's pause there for a moment. There's a few questions come in through the chat. I'm going to pick a few, and then we may come back to some others. Natalie is asking, and you mentioned noise in your presentation, and Becky did too. So she's just asking whether using the trees as a noise barrier, the trees might not be mature enough to act as a noise barrier in the first instance. Is that a consideration? And also whether or not the fans cooling the site work harder in hot weather and therefore cause more noise when it's hotter.
Yeah, did you want me to go first?
Yeah, you've got.
Yeah, no. So it's like a really important topic for us. We generally use, it's not generally, we always use the worst case scenario data that we've got when we're doing our noise assessments. As was mentioned, you know, the ambient temperature does affect the fan speeds and how much cooling that these units need. So the way that we approach that is that we use the worst case scenario, so the hottest time all the time, and with the highest fan speed. If that works, great. If that doesn't work, then there's mitigations that we would put in, either acoustic fencing. As I mentioned, you know, we've got the earth bund on the Drakelow project. And then, you know, it doesn't stop there as well, right? Once the project is built, we then gather operational data. We have responsibilities that we deploy to our suppliers as well. They've got to make, you know, it's all contracted. It can't be, it doesn't just get left. We make sure that the sites are operating as designed, as within the, you know, the planning requirements.
Thanks, Gary. There's a question about the opinion around how many sites we've got in the pipeline versus CP30 objectives. I'm going to open that to see if Holly or Dale or Gary, you want to comment on that in terms of, you know, we've got a big pipeline of sites, we've got CP30. Is there an issue here?
Yeah, my answer might be slightly different to Holly's. I think, look, the targets have been derived by NESO. There is a lot of skepticism in the industry of whether those targets are actually high enough. Clearly, we've got 2030 targets, 2035 targets, and we've got a decarbonisation target of 2050 as well. you mentioned about the future energy scenarios and, you know, an increase in our electrification in heat and transport and everything else. So there is a lot of skepticism about those targets. The majority of industry commentators feel like they are too low and they've been set too low. It wasn't that long ago that that National Grid, when they were a private entity, were suggesting that only 600 megawatts of battery energy storage would be needed, and now we're sitting here with 6.3 gigawatts built with a large pipeline. Also, those projects that are in the plan for delivery in by 2030 may not deliver. I mentioned that you know, the projects economics are quite challenging in majority of cases. A project's ability to be built is ultimately whether it's able to get investment, and things like how feasible the connection is and how viable the project is in terms of its financial viability are quite significant pieces of the puzzle. And without sort of you know, putting a negative spin on people's developments in a planning forum, you know, not every project will be built, and there will be a large amount of what we call attrition between now and 2035. But ultimately, as renewable energy developers and owner operators, we're chasing that sustainability piece and that net zero piece, decarbonisation. We want to see as many projects as possible get built, whether they're our own or other people's projects. But hopefully that answers it from our perspective.
Maybe jump in and add something to that.
Yeah, sure.
I think you covered that really well. You would need to consent more than the target in order to meet the target, because like you're saying, there's an attrition, there's certain projects will not come forward for various reasons, land ownership, supply chain issues, all that kind of thing, financial close for a lot of projects. So yes, if you consent more than that target, you're more likely to meet the target, ironically.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dale. Yeah,
I did see a comment flash up as a notification saying about I can't find it actually now. It's saying about nobody's ever seen a viability assessment in a planning application. Which I think that's because it's not required. Ultimately, that's the economic requirement of our projects. But ultimately, we enter the process in developing a project. We're spending a large amount of money bringing the projects forward through the consenting process and everything else. We want to ensure that those projects can be built at the end of it. Not everybody has that same experience level, and yeah, like I said, the viability, I'm not aware that it is a requirement in planning, so we wouldn't provide it. It's a commercial point which changes regularly. Yeah,
thank you. There's lots more questions in the chat, Gary, if you are able to have a look after when we move on to solar. There's one more that just is more of a clarification. So you talked about the need for flexibility for the colour of the containers, and it seems like obvious to the non-engineers, to the non-specialists, that's a great thing to do, is make them green. Why would you not want them to be green? I know there's a good reason. So I'm going to give you a response.
Yeah, do you want me to answer that one again?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, it's a fairly reasonable request, right? Is why can't they be green? I suppose one of the challenges we're finding is that manufacturers and original equipment manufacturers don't always allow their products to be that color. So certain manufacturers who have white containers, and it's the majority actually, are using white based on their thermal properties. So we are not going to be able to change some of those manufacturers, but some manufacturers do allow it. And so what we try to do through the planning process is make sure that we are not limited through the supply chain or through the procurement process, because ultimately we want to ensure that we're deploying the best battery technology into this into our country. So if you were to say, well, you've got to have green batteries, then that would limit quite a large proportion of the tier one suppliers that we would be expecting to use in our projects, and that might not be palatable for other reasons. Ultimately, we don't want to be bringing inferior projects into the UK.
Thank you, Dale. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, just a related point to that. So you mentioned that the modeling for heat within the system is on the basis of the white containers quite often. If you're to paint them dark green, they'll absorb more heat, especially in the summer. And then you need to run the fans harder in order to cool them down because they're not reflecting heat. So there's a planning balance in there between more landscape impact from having them white or having more noise impact from having them green. So as a planner, it's always important to weigh these things up. It's just to be conscious that there's consequences of changing these things. Yes, they appear visually better, dark green, but there's consequences sometimes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Holly. She's going to introduce our solar guidance. Holly, can you just mention about the draft status of the guidance, where we are with that when you're introduced? Thanks so much to Gary and Dale for that. We will come back at the end as well, try and pick up a few more questions, as well as try and answer them in the chat or after the meeting. So yeah, don't feel like we won't get to you. We will do. Let's just, on purposes of time, I'm going to hand over to Holly.
Yeah, thanks, Hazel. Yeah, just to come back on the draft status of the guidance again. So it's currently in draft status, which has been shared with you. The final guidance will be published at the end of March. And we have been incorporating some feedback from industry, from planners, as Hazel said, lots of feedback from government as well. But we're currently finalising the solar and battery guidance, so we won't be able to incorporate further comments at the moment. But yeah, do keep sharing your questions because it's really helpful to know which parts are going to be the most useful for people. And yeah, moving on to some information about our solar guidance today. We've got another one of these Menti polls on the screen, so do use the link in the chat from earlier or the QR code and just share a bit about what your level of experience is in assessing solar applications. It's starting to look like, yeah, there may be some more sort of higher levels of experience with solar, potentially where this technology has been around a little bit longer than batteries. And as we said, there's definitely a high level already in the southeast. So yeah, looks like a lot of people have maybe assessed 1 or 2 projects. Some people haven't yet. Yeah, there may be more coming through, as we mentioned, sort of in the future. I'll just give this a few more seconds to allow some more people to respond. But again, looks like no one is a solar expert planner on this call, so that's good to know. Great. Okay, I think we'll get going to get through the content. So on to the next slide. Thanks, Hazel. Just for a bit of regional context again in the southeast, when we look at where England's operational solar capacity is at the moment, a lot of it is in the southwest and the southeast, with almost half of it, 42% located in the southeast at the moment. And there's also a significant amount of solar coming forward in the pipeline. So there's currently 4.2 gigawatts in planning at the moment in this region, with 3.3 of those gigawatts having been submitted in the last 2 years. And there's another 5.6 gigawatts awaiting construction. So definitely a lot of new solar developments coming forward, and you may well be seeing an increase in applications in line with those CP30 targets that we discussed earlier. But if we move on to the next slide, solar is also becoming a more important part of our energy mix nationally. So last year, solar generated 6.3% of Britain's energy, peaking at reaching 43% of our electricity generation on one day in summer. So it's becoming much more significant. It's also helpful to know that although solar generates more electricity during the middle of the day and in the summer season, it doesn't require direct sunlight to generate electricity, so it can still generate on cloudy days, and it can also operate more efficiently in cooler temperatures. But those variable levels of generation that we get from solar can be really well complemented by battery storage, like we've already mentioned, but also by other types of renewable technologies. So the chart on the right here shows how much wind and solar electricity was generated every day last year. And as you can see, there were relatively few days where both wind and solar generation were low at the same time. Often, days that have lower levels of solar generation will have higher levels of wind generation, and days that have lower levels of wind electricity will have higher levels from solar. So these different types of technologies can complement each other really well on the energy system. And another thing that we just wanted to flag on this page is some useful context is the UK Solar Task Force, which is a government industry body that published the UK Solar Roadmap. And that document sets out some really helpful information on the different opportunities to drive rooftop and ground-mounted solar deployment in the country, and to also support new skills and jobs through that development. If we move on to the next slide, thanks Hazel. We just wanted to flag some of the recent changes that we've been seeing in this technology. So on the left here, we have a diagram similar to what Becky showed earlier for batteries, and this is included in our draft guidance document. And it just sets out some of the key components that you might often find in a solar farm and what a typical site layout may look like. But in recent years, we have seen the size of solar projects increasing. These are now often, covering larger areas of land, and more of them are connecting at the higher voltage transmission level of the electricity network. There's also been the change to planning routes. So as of the 31st of December 2025, solar projects up to 100 megawatts are now assessed through the TCPA regime, with the threshold for nationally significant infrastructure projects being moved up from 50 megawatts to 100 megawatts. So that means that as local authorities, you may now be assessing projects that are larger and have higher capacities. And another way that this technology is changing, similarly to with batteries, is that the efficiency of solar panels has been improving over time. So it's increased from 15% to now some models over 24%, which means solar farms can generate more electricity per unit area at a site. It's also helpful to know that there are different types of solar panels. So you can also get bifacial solar panels, which have solar cells on both sides and generate electricity on both sides of the panel. And also, the optimum angle for a solar panel will change as the position of the sun changes in the sky throughout the day and throughout the season. So you can get fixed solar panels that will stay at the best average angle for generating electricity over time. But you can also get tracking solar panels, which will move to follow the sun as it moves to maximize the amount of electricity they can generate. And those can either be single axes, which will move either vertically or horizontally, or they can be double axes, which will move both vertically and horizontally and capture even more electricity. But those tracking panels are more expensive and they can also require more maintenance. So that again is just a sort of balance that developers have to consider when designing sites. If we move on to the next slide, one of the most common points of contention for solar farm developments is land use, and agricultural land in particular. And the site requirements for solar farms to have areas that are relatively flat with high levels of sunlight do naturally often correspond with areas that are currently used for farming. And the National Planning Policy Framework is really clear in safeguarding the best and most versatile agricultural land and knowing that it's important to protect that land. Developers can take this into account by factoring in agricultural land classification data into their site selection process, and also by using more detailed field level surveys to help minimize impacts within their site and put the infrastructure on areas of lower quality where possible. But it is important to note that solar farms are temporary and they won't affect the agricultural quality of the land once the infrastructure is removed at the end of its lifetime, as long as the soil is managed well. You can also continue some forms of agricultural production on a site during the operation of a solar farm. So often this is in the form of grazing around and below the solar panels, but you are less likely to have open arable crop production on a solar site. The main forms of disturbance to the soil at a solar farm come during construction, when the cable routes are put in, as well as the access tracks, and also potentially some small foundations for the inverters and substation buildings. But the solar panels themselves have quite a small impact on soil. So as you can see from the top picture on the right there, usually piles are used to mount the solar panels, and these have quite a small impact on land, which means that for most of the soil across a solar farm, it can actually be given a rest and a chance to restore during the lifetime of the solar farm. So if we go on to the next slide, we have a case study that gives some helpful context on how this can be applied. So this is from a decision in May 2025, which was based on a 40-hectare site, of which 84% was best and most versatile agricultural land. And the inspector concluded a few key points here. One was that the status of the site as BMV would be safeguarded, provided there was a planning condition to put in place a soil management plan. So that meant that once the site was decommissioned, it would still be classified as best and most versatile land. The inspector also concluded that the land would not be used to its maximum potential as best and most versatile land during the duration of the site, so there was that loss of food production. However, in this case, the inspector acknowledged the prospect of improving soil condition due to the break from arable crop production and actually gave that a countervailing moderate weight. So just really interesting that in this case, that benefit for soil condition was taken into account in the decision. If we move on to the next slide again, another issue that relates to land use is the concept of overplanting. So we've got a bit of a graphic on the right there. At a solar farm, the solar panels themselves tend to generate electricity in direct current, which then gets converted into alternating current at inverters before being fed onto the electricity network. And overplanting refers to when developers install more solar panels than they need to meet the capacity of the inverters, or the export capacity, the amount of electricity they're allowed to export to the network. And the reason that they might do this is because the solar panels aren't going to be operating at their full capacity all of the time, depending on differences in weather conditions and so on. So by having more solar panels there, they can increase the amount of the time that they will meet that export capacity of generation, which means that for more of the time, they can maximize the amount of electricity they export to the grid. And overplanting can also help offset any degradation in the panel efficiencies over the lifetime of the site. So there's some really helpful case law setting out how this should be considered in the planning process. And it does make it clear that when deciding whether a solar farm application is a nationally significant infrastructure project or should go through the Town and Country Planning Act regime, that decision is based on the export capacity, the capacity of the inverters, rather than the capacity of the solar panels. And there's a really helpful legal blog here that will be, you'll be able to access the link when we share the slides, that sets out a bit more information on how overplanting can be considered in planning. If we move on to the next slide again, I just wanted to touch on biodiversity quickly. So the impacts on nature and wildlife of sites will vary on a case-by-case basis, especially depending on the context and whether any protected species or habitats are present. But there is an increasing body of research that does suggest that when solar farms are managed well and appropriately, they can deliver significant benefits for biodiversity. And this includes studies from the RSPB and from Solar Energy UK that I'd recommend reviewing. And they've also set out that these impacts do depend on how a site is managed. And there is good practice guidance available for developers to help them manage sites in a way that can deliver this really well. And many solar farms also deliver their mandatory biodiversity net gain requirements through on-site habitat enhancements and measures that are designed to increase biodiversity. So that's a good opportunity just to be aware of. But moving on to visual impacts, similarly to battery storage units, solar panels aren't that big. They're typically 1.5 to 3 meters above the ground. And planning practice guidance actually sets out that depending on the topography and the screening planting, the zone of visual influence of a solar farm could be 0. But of course, that's not always going to be the case, and visual impacts, again, do need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And it's particularly important to think about the cumulative impacts, especially looking at a region where there are already high levels of operational solar and there are more projects coming forward. And planning practice guidance sets out that this is the degree to which renewable energy developments become a feature in particular views or sequences of views. Glint and glare are also an important part of solar visual impacts. Solar panels are designed to absorb sunlight rather than reflect it, which means that they generally have impacts similar to other glass in rural areas, such as windows. But a glint and glare assessment is often still completed by developers and included in a landscape and visual impact assessment to set out whether the panels will be reflecting light at particular receptors at particular times, and whether the panels are fixed or tracking panels will also affect that assessment. And landscape impacts in a similar way can be low if mitigated well. If we move on to the next slide, we can discuss that a bit more. So again, they can be low as they are screened by planting and follow field patterns, but it will depend on the site-specific characteristics. And it's important again to think about the cumulative impacts. So a cumulative visual impact assessment might use photo montages to show the proposed scheme alongside existing and consented solar projects, as well as those which have submitted planning applications in the area. So that's a really helpful way of assessing those. And again, planning practice guidance sets out when it comes to landscape impacts, that's really considering the effect of the proposed development on the fabric, character, and quality of the landscape. We've got a couple more impacts just to touch on before I hand over. So the next one is archaeology. Archaeological impacts, of course, are a common thing to assess in planning, and similarly for solar, can follow standard guidance. But there is some really helpful guidance that's specifically tailored to assessing archaeological impacts of solar farms. As we mentioned before, solar farms have limited impacts on soil, which means that they can generally be designed to protect archaeological assets that are identified. And a potential form of mitigation can be swapping out those piles, which are often used to mount panels, with concrete shoes that have much more shallow impacts on soil. but also trial trenching can be used to identify any archaeological assets. And where it's appropriate, that can be secured as a post-consent planning condition to help avoid any unnecessary disturbance to the soil. But yeah, I would just signpost this guidance from the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, which is currently being developed, but they have a draft available on their website for review, which sets out some really helpful solar-specific factors to consider. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to touch on is flooding. So on the next slide, yeah, we've got another photo here that just shows again the frames used to mount solar panels have limited impact on soil. I think there can be a conception that rainwater will drain off solar panels and could cause an increase in flood risk on site or nearby, but actually rainwater can commonly still drain through the grass that's left between and underneath panels. And also the access tracks on a site tend to be permeable. So a drainage plan may be required for the impermeable areas, but that will usually be limited to the foundations of substations and inverters. And sites should follow all the standard requirements for flood risk assessments and testing. But that was everything I wanted to touch on today, so I'll pass back to Hazel.
Thanks, Holly. We're going to move on to James's case study. So James from Starlight Energy is here, and then we will have a bit of time to wrap up some of the questions right at the end. So I'm going to hand straight over to James. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me on today. Hopefully there are a couple of slides here that I've prepared earlier. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having me on today. I'm going to show you some details of our Hatherton solar farm, which has very recently been connected to the grid. A long time in development, reasonably straightforward planning determination, well, certainly from a timescales perspective, and a reasonably complex construction phase for various reasons. But yeah, we're pleased to say it's been energized in the last few months. So this is hot off the press in some ways. If we're able to flick on to the next slide, I'd be grateful. Thank you. Yep, so for a bit of context, Hatherton Solar Farm, which you can see in the top photo there, is just on the outskirts of Andover. The planning authority is Test Valley. I've put the planning reference in there in case you want to have a look at it at some point. For a bit of context, I've been working in solar for about 12 years. We worked on sort of larger scale sites, and then the subsidy was reduced down to 5 megawatts, and we spent a few years working on 5 megawatt schemes, which are roughly about 10 hectares in size. The subsidy was removed. We developed a business model that enabled us to get into the subsidy-free market quite early. And if I'm honest, when our land team brought this site to me, I was a bit apprehensive. It's quite close to an area of outstanding natural beauty, now national landscape. It's got a long distance footpath running through it. It's quite near a couple of villages, reasonably picturesque villages. The right-of-ways around the site. So it was a bit of a test of faith of the kind of new world that we were entering on the subsidy-free side of things. It says a 50 megawatt solar farm. It's about 80 hectares in size. So there were quite a few issues for us to work through, and the approach we took, as usual, trying to do things proactively and build up a positive relationship with the LPA. We did some pre-application discussions. We did some community engagement with the local community through the parish council, and various issues were raised at that point. We altered the scheme slightly before we submitted the planning application, received a whole lot of feedback, including quite a lot of objections. The parish councils objected, and we made some alterations to the scheme, primarily a reduction in scale of the scheme. As was alluded to earlier, the kind of scale and the size of individual solar panels has increased a lot over time, especially recently, and even during the determination of this application, the technology had evolved sufficiently that we were able to reduce the physical footprint of the solar farm, but the power of each individual panel would increase. That allowed us to get the same kind of energy generation, if not even an even higher energy generation from the proposals. So we altered the scheme, re-engaged with the community, and I'm pleased to say that the community or the parish council withdrew their objection. There were no further public objections, and it ended up being a delegated approval in July 2020, which was great news. If we move on to if we just hang on there for a second, actually, if we're able to go back one step. So the top photo there, you can sort of see around the the edge of the solar farm. We've got various bridleways and a sort of green corridor. And the bottom photo there is taken from the high point of the site. It's tricky to see in this photo, but the solar panels are actually in that lower photo. And the change we made around that part of the site was to be able to, or was to move the panels further away from the bridleway, which the photographer is standing on, and avoid the panels sort of skylining this day below the horizon and the kind of medium to long distance. So this was a key design issue that, you know, was flagged up to us by the locals. You know, they asked us to kind of take into account the sort of open feeling of the view from the bridleway that went around the edge. So, you know, the change we were able to make in that location, I think, was highly effective. If we do now move on, thank you. We've got the landscape master plan that accompanied the application on the left-hand side here. And as you can see in that southeastern field, the panels and the fence line go almost all the way up to the woodlands in the middle of the site. And then on the right-hand side of the screen is the amended landscape master plan. And I've put a red line around the area that we focused amendments on, where we created a green corridor around the edge of the site, or the edge of the solar farm itself, with the bridleway running along the edge of that under the trees. And the yellow arrow pointing towards the southeast is the approximate location that the photo on the previous slide was taken from. So you can see we've opened up the space around the bridleway quite a lot. And if we move on, I think one more click, I think there's another diagram. Yeah, so yeah, it's just a blow up of that previous photo. You can see there from that high point where that orange arrow is, you can see the solar panels and the sort of short or kind of close to the bridleway with the horizon in the background. The original photo montage and application, the panels would have been kind of blocking that longer view. So yeah, we were pleased with the way planning unfolded on this site. We had to work really hard to gain, you know, the local community's support for the project. We introduced a whole lot of other changes relating to traffic management and archaeology, and noise constraints and working hours, etc., that helped win their support as well. But yeah, for me, it was a bit of a kind of threshold moment as we moved into the larger scale subsidy-free phase of the solar sector. So yeah, hopefully that was of reasonable interest. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on that. My contact details are there as well if you want to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks, James. That's great. So we've got a little bit of time now until 3:30 to have some questions. There's a few come in, so I'll try and curate them a bit. There's one, James and Dale, on fire risk for solar. Like, is that actually an issue that needs to be considered? Yeah, over to you, James.
Certainly compared to the BESS side of things, it's not a major issue. I think to date, I've never had to prepare or organise a fire risk assessment or any information in response to fire and rescue services feedback for a purely solar development. I get, there is a fire risk there, but the solar farms are fairly mature technology now. They're strictly governed in terms of their design codes and the way they're constructed and operated. And I think, compared to the BESS developments, fire risk is even lower than those. So it's not something really that we've had to contend with. And when we do it, we've, as a group, we have projects around the world, and it's more, the fire risk factor is more related to a site's surroundings. So in drier countries, hotter, drier countries, there are local bylaws and rules about setbacks to vegetation and keeping clear areas and avoiding dry grass around sites, that sort of thing. But in a more temperate, slightly damper country such as ours, that's less of an issue.
Thank you. Gary, did you want to go back to fire risk and batteries? Just there was a question about how it can be an issue at committee, and then the inspector can say no, that's fine. Yeah, can you revisit that just in brief?
Yeah, this might open a can of worms. So I think there's generally, over the past few years, been a disconnect between what the the original NFCC guidance was there to do versus how it was being used by local fire services, then how it was being sort of treated and understood and sort of actioned by local planning authorities. The biggest disconnect really is around the standards that the BES suppliers meet and their actions upon an incident. We've had really good engagement with local fire services throughout the deployment of our project since 2018. Generally speaking, they just treat it like any other large-scale industrial business. But once the original NFCC guidance came out, we just ended up finding that we were embroiled in this sort of, that's what the paper says, so that's what you must have, and there was no flexibility. So what I think the outcome of that was that we ended up with this sort of like local disconnect and things being rejected at planning committee. Maybe they were recommended for approval by the planning authority, but rejected by planning committee because of this concern and this disconnect. And then the inspector sort of looking at the details and saying, well, actually, that's meeting the requirements. Maybe not exactly, but the intent of what the guidance was required to. The intent of what the guidance was alluding to. So that tends to be where the disconnect has been. I know from our business, we've been engaged with the NFCC for a long time. We've obviously been engaged with our suppliers for a long time as well to try and ensure that they're getting their message across into the industry better, irrespective of who that battery supplier is, but trying to get people to understand that there is differences in the approach to thermal runaway, how it's detected, how it's potentially stopped in different ways, and ultimately how an incident may be managed, like not spraying water onto a container that may be on fire, if it was to even exit the cabinet or the actual rack itself. So I think it's been a challenging piece, but we've sort of managed to get that sort of broader understanding. I think we're not there, by the way, but I think we're closer to it.
Thanks, Gary. Dale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is exactly where we should be coming from. One thing to note from a planning perspective is that planners are not fire experts. We have a general understanding, as we do in most topics, but sometimes you'll have a consultee that will provide information saying no objection on this, and then the application is subsequently refused on that risk that the experts have said there's no objection to, which is quite a frustrating situation, quite a frustrating topic, especially if it's going through the councillors and the councillors have their own views. That is when the NFCC guidance is particularly helpful. If you can point to the experts and say, look, if they don't have a concern, why are we concerned? I think that goes for quite a few other topics. It's the same mindset that just says, keep it proportionate to the potential scale of the impact.
Thank you. Yeah, let's tick off a few of those. So there's a question about lighting for solar and for batteries. So James, what sort of lighting do you need for your solar farm?
Yeah, typically it's just emergency lighting above the substation doors. If it's a really big substation, like if it's a transmission connection, there might be some emergency flood lighting within the substation compound itself, but there's no, it's basically a dark site, so there's no motion activated lighting, there's no time sort of automatic lighting that comes on at certain times. The vast majority of the time, it wouldn't be visible at night. It would only require, the lighting would only require to be used if for some reason you were undertaking unplanned maintenance at night. If it was a problem on the network and engineers had to go out during the night and get access into the substation, for obvious health and safety reasons, they would need to use the lighting above the substation door or in the compound. But we tend to find that lighting is pretty easily controlled and managed in an agreeable way through condition requiring a lighting plan or maximum lux levels and direction of lighting set out in something like the construction environmental management plan. So yeah, for all intents and purposes, a dark site and any lighting that is required can be sensitively installed.
Thank you. And Gary,
lighting? It's the same. So the dark sites, we use infrared cameras to see in the dark, and as James said, they would only be used if there was unplanned maintenance during, that occurred during darkness. We also have to submit a lighting scheme as well, so exactly the same. It's not planned to be lit during the night or in darkness, and any lighting scheme has to be is supplied through the planning process and approved.
That's great, thank you. Okay, let's talk about recycling and decommissioning for both types of technology. So how does that impact your the planning stage, James?
Sorry, was that broke up there slightly? So that was to do with the choice of technology, was it?
Yeah, no, the kind of the recycling considerations and decommissioning, end of life considerations.
Yeah, so I mean, as some of today's attendees might be aware, a lot of wind farms have been repowered, or turbines have been replaced. And 5-10 years ago, there wasn't much of an industry for reusing wind farm components. That's now changed. Solar is slightly behind the curve in that respect. But as and when sites are repowered or upgraded, the vast majority of the materials that are on site and form the solar panels can be reused and recycled. And the repowering side of things, it hasn't really sprung up yet for solar the way it has with wind. But we had a site with one operational site in Scotland, which tells you all you need to know about the climate up here. But it was badly damaged in a storm 3-4 years ago. It's quite an old site. It's probably 8 or 9 years old. And when it was rebuilt, it used 2/3 of the original land take because the panels are more powerful. So there will be a re-energization or a repowering phase for operational solar. And what we're expecting is, and we're starting to see that already, some of the materials are already being recycled, but the vast majority of materials on a solar farm can be recycled: steel, glass, copper, etc.
Thank you. And Gary, in relation to your sites, how does that play into the original planning and the end of life considerations?
Yeah, so I think I was trying to write a response to that before, but I didn't want to just end up going down a rabbit hole. But generally speaking, the question is correct, is that there is a usable life for batteries, but that usable life is dependent on a number of factors, including how much you use them in the intervening time. So generally speaking, we have contracts in place that warranty the performance, and the life of a utility scale battery could be anywhere between 15 and 20 years. So the question is right. There is likely to be a replant within that 40-year planning cycle. The products themselves on the market are full of raw materials. Those raw materials are precious, and the recycling rate can be anywhere between 92 and 98% of a battery container. So from a lithium ion battery container perspective, the recycling ability of that, like I said, can be anywhere between 92 and 98%. Don't think we have to specify, like I said, I'm not a planner, so I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'm not sure we specifically have to identify the recycling within our planning applications, but as a developer and an owner operator, we have investors and shareholders that want us to meet those requirements, and clearly there's a requirement at the decommissioning stage. So but yeah, I think that's probably where we are at the moment. And it should also be, it's important to also say that I think what James was saying there about reusing things. So we're already seeing companies spring up that are taking used electric vehicle batteries and other batteries and actually repurposing them rather than just sending them for recycling. But ultimately, the recycling chain is developing as we move through deploying more and more batteries.
Thank you. And there's also a question about the supply chain and where they come from, which isn't really in the planning guidance because there's not a planning issue as such. But have you got a kind of a response around where does lithium come from, etc.?
Comes from Cornwall now, I think, doesn't it? I saw something the other day. We've got a new plant that's also kicking out some geothermal, which is great. But on a serious point is that, and it's probably one of the bits that the earlier presentation missed about the transition between NMC technology and lithium phosphate. So there's a couple of other benefits that weren't on that table. The first one is that the critical minerals for NMC are generally the ones that have been linked to maybe some more of the slave type of raw material trade in Africa, so the manganese and the cobalt. Clearly, LFP technology doesn't use those raw materials, so that it's not included within that supply chain. I mentioned about using tier one suppliers and that issue around the color of the batteries. Well, tier one suppliers have got a fully auditable and fully tracked supply chain all the way down to the lithium and to where the steel's coming from and everything else. So, and that is something that we do as part of our procurement piece as well. So the natural evolvement of the actual chemistry itself, but also, you know, as we rolled out more batteries into the UK, developers, owner operators, you know, the market, there's more sensitivity around that supply chain and more scrutiny as well. But in general, you know, the batteries are coming from, we don't tend to make a huge amount of batteries in Europe at the moment. So they're coming from places like China. One of the factories we used was a completely carbon negative factory in Mongolia. It was one of the suppliers that we used, tier one supplier, or America. But there are some smaller manufacturers in the UK. So Envision build the batteries for the Nissan cars up in Sunderland, you know, from scratch, from literally raw materials, steel and whatever else, you know, precision steel coming from Japan. So on little reels. So it's really cool stuff to be going on in the UK, but we don't do it at scale, unfortunately, in the UK, and we do import that capability.
Thank you. We've not got very long left. I just want to cover local plans because this session has been very much focused on applications and your role as planners in those, but obviously we also have a local planning policy. So I was going to ask Dale if you wanted to comment on what's helpful to see in local plans. What are we seeing in local plans? Should we allocate areas for solar, for batteries?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. So we've come across essentially the same discussion around wind back in the day, and the discussion around wind was where should local authority planners position the areas for wind, which is a great conversation. But from a local authority perspective, you're looking mostly around where they're going to be less impact, whereas developers are looking at where's the highest yield and where are the grid connections, where can we, you know, how can we bring these turbines to site, so the specific sites have benefits for that. There's quite a disconnect between local authority planning desires for the locations versus for developers themselves. So when it comes to solar, it's almost exactly the same thing. We need to make sure that there's a conversation between local authorities and developers to make sure that we're not allocating tiny little strips of a site that is off in the middle of nowhere that is not useful to a developer. It can't be too specific to an individual site because you end up the site never being used. It has to have enough flexibility that allows both parties to be happy, essentially. And we're watching that space. We've been quite carefully monitoring outcomes for local plans, and we've been following up in every lead we can find to make sure that there's a reasonable approach taken to that. Nationally, there's better guidance on that, and we're just keeping an eye on it over time.
Thank you. And so linked to that, but not exactly the same question, one of the things that comes up in planning applications and refusals and in appeals is about agricultural land use, the kind of food versus energy debate. Yeah, Dale, do you want to go on that first?
Yeah,
and then pass to James after that?
Yeah, of course. So the National Farmers Union has a really good response on that point. They are particularly keen on solar, which is a bit of a change around from, I think, a previous position they had. We all know the state of farming at the moment. You know, we've all seen Clarkson's farm. So there's complaints around the viability of farming, and if you can diversify land, then that's additional income for farmers, as long as you're not completely wiping out the farm to replace it with solar. It's being careful and conscious of those sorts of issues. There's a couple of other points in there around nutrients and the quality of the land. So I believe there's obligations to maintain the previous standard of land after the development has been removed. And certainly you'll have seen from the images of the foundations required for solar panels, they are a spike in the ground. There's no huge amount of excavation going on there. So there's a few points in the agricultural side that have come out recently. The National Farmers Union guidance has been the most helpful for me getting my head around that topic. I would advise anyone to have a quick look through it.
Thanks very much. And James, I'll give the final word to you, and then we'll wrap in a second.
No pressure. I mean, the arguments and the discussions around BMV and agricultural land use are really interesting, and I think, being frank, they've been latched onto by certain groups and some sectors of the media, etc., because there's a perception that if you're bringing forward a site which is on grade 1 or 2 or 3A land, it's quantified, it's a quantifiable issue rather than more of a qualitative, subjective issue like landscape and visual issues. But there's nothing in planning policy that outright prevents schemes or solar schemes or low carbon or renewable energy schemes being approved in those locations. What we've found over the years, it's very location specific. So, for example, if you're bringing forward a solar farm on, say 80 hectares of best and most versatile land, and there's a very limited supply in the plan area, the local plan area of best and most versatile land, it's going to be much more difficult to justify the choice of that site for your scheme compared to an area such as East Lindsey Council in Lincolnshire, where there was an interesting appeal decision recently where a 50 megawatt solar farm on 111 hectares of grade 1 land was allowed. So, but East Lindsey Council, low-lying, very fertile, just about all the land in the LPA is best and most versatile. So it's important to keep it in context, I think, and under the CP30 plans, the amount of agricultural land which is forecast to be required for solar, bearing in mind it stays in agricultural use, is a tiny proportion of overall land supply, and it's a small proportion of that area again, which would be best and most versatile land. So I think keeping it in context and realising that it's a very small proportion of overall land supply that we're trying to add this extra land use onto is key.
Thank you so much. There is a feedback form. It's at this link, which Holly will drop into the chat, and also will be in the slides when you get emailed to them. We love your feedback on this training session. We are still going to deliver it one more time, and we still need to deliver it on onshore wind and networks. So any feedback for us is really helpful. The next session, as it says, is on Thursday the 19th of March at 2 p.m. So if you haven't already signed up, again, the link will be there. And just a quick thank you to everyone for your active participation through the chat, and also to James from Starlight Energy, to Gary from Harmony Energy, and to Dale from Land Use Consultants for your active responses to the questions. And that was fast and furious and yeah, really enjoyable. Thank you so much.